Every man carries scars that no one else can see. Every crown weighs heavier than the world imagines. King Thorne rules from his throne of stone and silence, feared across 7 kingdoms for his merciless reign. 15 years of conquest have carved him into something harder than the steel he wields. His queen died young, taking his heart to the grave, and he's ruled through blood and iron ever since. No lord meets his eyes. No knight challenges his word. The very mention of his name makes grown warriors tremble. Today, tribute arrives from a conquered province. Gold, livestock, and one unusual gift that will shatter everything he believes about power. A blind woman named Elira is brought before him in chains. The court expects swift execution, as is his way. But what happens when the most feared king alive meets someone who sees him without eyes? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The great iron doors of Drakmore Castle groaned open with the weight of centuries, their massive hinges protesting against another dawn of judgment and despair. Carved from the living mountain itself, the fortress rose like a blackened tooth against the grey morning sky, its towers piercing the clouds that perpetually shrouded the northern realm. Within these walls, silence reigned supreme, broken only by the echo of steel-shod boots on ancient stone and the occasional cry of ravens that nested in the highest battlements. King Thorne's throne room stretched before him like a cathedral of shadows, its vaulted ceiling lost in darkness above the iron braziers that cast dancing flames across walls, decorated with the banners of conquered enemies. The throne itself, a monstrosity of carved obsidian and twisted iron, dominated the far end of the hall, positioned to catch the morning light streaming through narrow windows set high in the walls. From this seat, Thorne had dispensed justice and death with equal measure for 15 long years, transforming from the hopeful young prince who had once dreamed of a golden age into something far more terrible and efficient. Sir Gareth stood at attention beside the throne, his weathered face bearing the scars of 100 battles fought in service to his king. Captain of the Royal Guard for 20 years, he had watched Thorne's transformation with a mixture of loyalty and growing concern. His greying beard was meticulously trimmed, his armor polished to mirror brightness, but his eyes held the weariness of a man who had seen too much death in service to duty. Behind him, 6 guards in black mail stood at perfect attention, their faces hidden beneath steel helms that reflected the firelight like empty skulls. Across the hall, near the massive oak doors, Lord Aldrich conferred in whispered tones with a cluster of lesser nobles, his silk robes and jeweled fingers marking him as a man more comfortable with intrigue than swordplay. Chief advisor to the crown for the past decade, he had risen to power through careful maneuvering and an uncanny ability to survive the frequent purges that marked Thorne's reign. His thin face bore the perpetual expression of a man calculating odds and angles, always positioning himself on the winning side of any conflict before it was decided. Lady Morgana moved through the shadows near the eastern wall like a wraith in grey robes, her herb pouches and healing implements marking her as the castle's chief healer. She alone, among the court, maintained a position of relative safety, for even tyrants required someone to mend their wounds and brew their sleeping draughts. Her silver hair was bound in intricate braids, adorned with small bones and crystals, and her pale eyes missed nothing of the subtle currents of power that flowed through the castle like underground rivers. The king himself sat motionless upon his throne, a figure carved from winter itself. At 39, Thorne bore the marks of a man who had aged beyond his years through violence and loss. His black hair, streaked with premature silver, fell to his shoulders in waves that caught the firelight like dark water. Tall and powerfully built, he wore simple black leather and mail beneath a cloak of midnight blue, scorning the elaborate robes favored by other monarchs. His hands, scarred from countless battles, rested on the armrests of his throne, and his grey eyes surveyed his court with the cold assessment of a predator cataloguing potential threats. Those eyes had once burned with different fires. 15 years ago, Prince Thorne had been known throughout the realm for his quick laughter and generous heart, a young man who spoke of justice and mercy with the fervour of the truly faithful. His marriage to Lady Lyanna of Rosemere had been celebrated as a union that would usher in an age of peace and prosperity, for she possessed a gift for diplomacy that perfectly complemented his martial prowess. Their love had been the stuff of songs, visible to all who saw them together in those golden months before tragedy struck. The memory of her death still haunted the castle like a restless spirit. Lyanna had died in childbirth on a storm-lashed night in winter, the child lost with her despite the efforts of every healer in the kingdom. Thorne had held her cooling hand through the long hours until dawn, and when he finally emerged from that chamber, something essential had died within him. The funeral pyre had consumed not only her body, but the last vestiges of the idealistic prince, leaving behind a king who ruled through fear because he no longer trusted in anything else. Now, his daily routine had become as rigid and predictable as the movement of the sun across the sky. Each morning brought a procession of petitioners seeking justice, mercy, or favor, and Thorne dispensed his verdicts with mechanical precision. Disputes over land were settled with the sword. Theft was punished by the loss of a hand. Treason meant death, swift and public. The nobles had learned to present their cases with careful brevity, for the king's patience was as short as his memory. Was long when it came to past grievances. The afternoon hours were reserved for military planning and the endless correspondence required to maintain control over 7 kingdoms. Maps covered every surface of his private study, marked with the movements of troops and the locations of potential rebellions. Reports arrived daily from his network of spies and tax collectors, each piece of parchment another thread in the web of control he had woven across his domain. He read every document personally, trusting no one else to interpret the subtle signs of brewing discontent or shifting alliances. Evenings found him alone in the highest tower of the castle, standing before the great window that looked out over his kingdom. He would remain there for hours, a solitary figure silhouetted against the stars, drinking wine that had lost its taste and contemplating the cost of the crown that weighed so heavily upon his brow. Sleep, when it came at all, was fitful and haunted by dreams of golden hair and laughter that no longer echoed through these halls. It was during one such morning of routine dispensation that the doors of the throne room opened to admit an unusual delegation. Lord Baelor of Ethros entered with the measured pace of a man who understood he was walking into the presence of death itself. A conquered province that had fallen to Thorne's armies only 6 months prior, Ethros had been ruled with an iron fist ever since. Its people ground down beneath the weight of tribute and occupation. Baelor himself was a man in his 50s. His once proud bearing now stooped with defeat and resignation. His clothes, while clean, showed the careful mending that spoke of reduced circumstances, and his retinue consisted of only 4 guards wearing the simple brown livery of his fallen house. Behind them came a train of servants leading pack animals laden with the quarterly tribute demanded by the crown. "Your Majesty," Baelor said, dropping to one knee before the throne, "I bring the tribute of Ethros as commanded." Thorne's grey eyes fixed upon the kneeling lord with the intensity of a hawk studying a field mouse. "Rise, Baelor. Present what you have brought." The servants came forward with careful precision, laying out chests of gold and silver, bolts of fine cloth, and samples of the grain that formed the backbone of Ethros's wealth. It was a respectable tribute, though Thorne noted with characteristic attention to detail that it was slightly less than the previous quarter's offering. Such things did not escape his notice, and he filed the information away for future consideration. "There is one additional offering, Your Majesty," Baelor said, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "A gesture of goodwill from my people." He gestured toward the back of the procession, where 2 of his guards supported a figure wrapped in a traveling cloak. As they came forward, Thorne could see that their burden was a woman, small and seemingly frail, who moved with the careful steps of one who could not see the path ahead. "This is Elira," Baylor continued, his words measured and careful. "She is gifted in ways that my people value highly. We offer her service to the crown as a token of our loyalty and submission." The woman raised her head as her name was spoken, and Thorne found himself looking into a face that struck him with unexpected force. She was young, perhaps 25, with dark hair that fell in waves around features that spoke of quiet strength rather than conventional beauty. But it was her eyes that captured his attention, clouded with the milky whiteness of blindness, yet somehow seeming to focus directly upon him with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably upon his throne. Elira wore simple brown robes that marked her as a commoner, but she carried herself with a dignity that seemed at odds with her circumstances. In her left hand, she gripped a staff of white ash wood, carved with symbols that caught the firelight in strange ways. When she spoke, her voice was clear and musical, carrying easily across the vast space of the throne room. "Your Majesty," she said, inclining her head in a gesture that was respectful without being servile, "I am at your service." The court held its collective breath, waiting for the familiar sound of steel being drawn from its sheath, the prelude to another execution that would remind them all of their king's absolute power. Thorne's hand had indeed moved toward the sword at his side, an automatic response to any potential threat, but something stayed his motion. Perhaps it was the woman's calm demeanor in the face of almost certain death, or the way she seemed to look through his carefully constructed facade of royal terror to something deeper beneath. For a long moment, silence stretched between them like a taut bowstring. Then, to the amazement of all present, Thorne leaned back in his throne and spoke a single word. "Interesting." Sir Gareth stepped forward, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "Your Majesty, shall I—" "No," Thorne interrupted, his gaze never leaving Elira's face. "She will remain. See that she is given quarters in the Eastern Tower and assigned to the kitchen staff. Lord Baylor, your tribute is accepted. You may go." The dismissal was clear and final, but as the delegation prepared to leave, Elira turned once more toward the throne. Her clouded eyes seemed to pierce through the shadows and firelight to focus directly on the king's face. "Thank you for your mercy, Your Majesty," she said quietly. "May it bring you the peace you seek." Then she was gone, following her escort from the throne room, leaving behind only the echo of her words and the lingering scent of herbs and mountain air. Thorne sat motionless upon his throne for a long time after the doors had closed, his mind turning over the strange encounter like a man examining a puzzle with too many missing pieces. That night, as he stood at his customary place before the tower window, he found himself wondering about the blind woman now residing somewhere below in his castle. There had been something in her voice, a quality he had not heard in years, something that reminded him of sunlight on water and the sound of distant laughter. For reasons he could not name, the memory of her words followed him into restless sleep, where they mingled with dreams of golden hair and eyes that could see far more than they should. The kitchen fires burned low in the hour before dawn, casting wavering shadows across the stone walls where Elira had spent her first week learning the rhythms of castle life. Her small chamber in the eastern tower was sparse but clean, furnished with a narrow bed, a wooden chest for her few belongings, and a small window that allowed her to track the passage of time through the changing quality of light against. Her closed eyelids each morning brought the same routine of careful navigation through corridors that grew more familiar with each passing day. Her fingers traced the worn stones of the walls, memorizing the texture of each surface, the location of every doorway and alcove. The servants who worked alongside her had moved from initial fear to grudging acceptance, though she could feel their curious glances and hear their whispered conversations when they thought she was not listening. "Poor thing," Martha the head cook would murmur while kneading bread. "Blind as a newborn kitten and twice as helpless. The king should have put her out of her misery right quick, instead of letting her suffer like this. Maybe he's saving her for something worse." young Tom, the scullery boy, would reply with the casual cruelty of youth. You know how he likes to make examples of people. Elira bore their pity and speculation with quiet dignity, focusing instead on the simple tasks assigned to her. Her hands were skilled at peeling vegetables and sorting grain, work that required touch rather than sight. She found a strange comfort in these humble duties, so different from the reverence and fear that had surrounded her in Ethros, where her gifts had marked her as something both sacred and dangerous. But it was not the servant's whispers that occupied her thoughts during those first days. It was the presence she could feel watching her from the shadows, a familiar weight of attention that made her skin prickle with awareness. King Thorne moved through his castle like a predator marking territory, and she had become an object of his curiosity in ways that both intrigued and frightened her. She sensed him in the corridors when she carried water to the upper floors, felt his gaze from darkened doorways when she crossed the courtyard with her arms full of firewood. He never approached, never spoke, but his attention followed her like a physical touch, intense and unwavering. Her supernatural senses, always active but carefully controlled, picked up fragments of his emotional state during these encounters, confusion, suspicion, and something else that felt remarkably like longing. The rain began falling on the 7th day of her residence, a steady downpour that turned the castle courtyards into networks of treacherous puddles and slick stones. Elira had been sent to fetch herbs from the garden for Lady Morgana's healing preparations, a task that required crossing the main courtyard to reach the small enclosed space where medicinal plants grew in careful rows. She moved with her usual care, her staff tapping against the stones to warn her of obstacles and changes in elevation. The rain soaked through her woolen cloak within minutes, plastering her dark hair against her skull and making her fingers numb with cold. Still, she persevered, following the mental map she had constructed of the castle's layout. It was the uneven stone step at the base of the garden entrance that proved her undoing. Her staff caught in a gap between the stones, twisting from her grip as she tried to maintain her balance. Without that crucial support, her foot landed on the rain-slicked surface at precisely the wrong angle, sending her tumbling backward toward the unforgiving cobblestones below. She had just enough time to throw her hands up to protect her head when strong arms caught her, pulling her against a chest clad in leather and mail. The scent of steel and sandalwood filled her nostrils, and she knew without question who had broken her fall. King Thorne's presence surrounded her like a physical force, his breathing slightly labored from the sudden exertion of catching her mid-fall. "Are you injured?" His voice was closer to her ear than she had ever imagined it would be, rough with concern that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. Elira tried to find her voice to respond, but the moment his skin touched hers, her carefully controlled abilities exploded into full awareness. The contact between his bare hand and her wrist where her sleeve had ridden up sent shockwaves of sensation through her consciousness, overwhelming her with images and emotions that crashed over her like a tide. She saw him as he had been, a young prince with laughing eyes and an easy smile, standing beside a woman with golden hair who looked at him as if he held the sun in his hands. She felt the pure joy of their wedding day, the desperate love that had consumed them both, the plans they had made for a future filled with children and peace. Then came the darkness, the storm-lashed night when everything changed. The midwife's terrified face, blood on white sheets, the sound of his wife's voice growing weaker with each labored breath, calling his name even as life fled from her body. The weight of the crown settling on his head like a curse, and the slow death of hope that followed. But beneath all of that pain, she sensed something else, a core of loneliness so profound it took her breath away. He had surrounded himself with walls of fear and cruelty, but at his center was simply a man who had loved once and lost everything, who now carried his grief like armor because it was the only thing that kept him from falling apart completely. "You carry such pain. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her hand instinctively reaching up to touch his face with fingers that trembled from more than cold. "You don't have to bear it alone." The words escaped her before she could think to stop them, driven by a compassion that overwhelmed her usual caution. For a moment, she felt his defenses crack, felt him lean into her touch like a man dying of thirst who had suddenly found water. His eyes, those cold grey eyes that struck terror into the hearts of his enemies, filled with an anguish so raw it made her heart break for him. Then the moment shattered. The psychic contact that had connected them so completely became too much for her human mind to process, and darkness rushed up to claim her consciousness. She felt herself falling again, but this time into a different kind of void, one where dreams and visions swirled together in a maelstrom of color and sensation. When awareness began to return, she found herself lying on something soft and warm, surrounded by voices that seemed to come from very far away. Her head felt as if it had been split open and filled with broken glass, and every breath sent fresh waves of pain through her skull. What did she do to him? Sir Gareth's voice, tight with suspicion and barely contained anger. "I've seen nothing like it," Lady Morgana replied, her tone thoughtful rather than accusatory. She collapsed the moment he touched her, as if the contact itself caused her pain. "Witchcraft," Lord Aldrich hissed from somewhere nearby. "Dark magic meant to ensnare our king. We should burn her before she can work more of her evil. Enough." Thorne's voice cut through the debate like a blade, quiet but carrying absolute authority. "She will be cared for. Lady Morgana, see to her injuries. The rest of you, leave us." Elira tried to open her eyes, but even the dim firelight in what she assumed was Lady Morgana's healing chamber felt like needles driving into her brain. She managed a soft moan of distress, which immediately brought the sound of footsteps approaching her bedside. "Rest easy, child," Lady Morgana said gently, her fingers cool against Elira's fevered forehead. "You've had some kind of shock. Your mind needs time to heal. Is she—" Thorne's voice again, but different somehow. The iron command was still there, but underneath it was something that sounded almost like fear. "She will recover," the healer assured him. "But whatever happened in that courtyard, it was not natural. I can sense the residue of power around her, like the echo of a great bell that has just finished ringing." Elira heard the scrape of a chair being pulled closer to her bed, followed by the whisper of fabric as someone settled beside her. She knew without opening her eyes that Thorne had chosen to keep vigil, and the knowledge sent warmth spreading through her chest despite the continuing pain in her head. "What are you?" he asked quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. She tried to form words, to explain the gift that had been both blessing and curse throughout her life. But exhaustion dragged her back towards sleep before she could manage more than a whispered, "I see truth." Hours passed in a haze of half-consciousness and strange dreams. Sometimes she was aware of voices discussing her condition, of gentle hands checking her pulse and adjusting her blankets. Other times she drifted through memories that were not her own, reliving moments from Thorne's past with a clarity that should have been impossible. When she finally woke fully, it was to find herself alone, except for a single guard stationed by the door. Daylight streamed through a small window, and the pain in her head had faded to a manageable ache. She sat up carefully, testing her balance, and was relieved to find that her body seemed to be functioning normally once again. The door opened to admit Lady Morgana, carrying a tray laden with bread, cheese, and a steaming mug of herbal tea. The healer moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to tending the sick and injured, but Elira could sense an undercurrent of curiosity in her manner. "How do you feel?" Morgana asked, setting the tray on a table beside the bed. "Better," Elira replied honestly. "Thank you for your care. It was the king who insisted you receive the best treatment available," Morgana said, studying her patient with intelligent eyes. "He spent most of the night in that chair, refusing to leave until I assured him you would survive." The revelation sent a flutter of something warm through Elira's chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "That was kind of him." "Kind is not a word often associated with our king," Morgana observed dryly. You have made quite an impression, child. The question is whether it will prove to be a blessing or a curse." Before Elira could respond, the door opened again to admit the king himself. In the daylight streaming through the window, she could see him more clearly than ever before, not with her eyes, which remained clouded and useless, but with the supernatural sight that had been awakened by their contact. He appeared as layers of light and shadow, the brightness of his true nature dimmed but not extinguished by the darkness he had wrapped around himself like a cloak. "Leave us," he commanded, and Lady Morgana withdrew without argument, though not without a meaningful look that Elira felt rather than saw. Thorne approached the bed slowly, as if she were a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the casual cruelty that had marked their first meeting in the throne room. "You spoke of truth," he said. "What truth did you see when you touched me?" Elira considered her words carefully, knowing that her answer could determine whether she lived to see another sunset. "I saw a man who has forgotten that his heart still beats beneath the armor he wears. I saw grief that has been allowed to fester instead of heal. And I saw a king who rules through fear because he has forgotten that he was once capable of inspiring love." The silence that followed her words stretched taut between them, filled with the weight of 15 years of carefully buried pain. When Thorne finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "She died in my arms. My wife, my queen. Everything good in me died with her that night." "No," Elira said firmly, turning her head toward the sound of his voice with an intensity that made him take a step back. "It didn't die. You buried it, but it lives still. I felt it when you caught me from falling. I felt it in the way you stayed with me through the night. The man she loved is still there, beneath all the pain and anger. You speak of things you cannot possibly know," he said, but there was no real conviction in his denial. "I know that you built a throne from her memory and ruled from it for 15 years, Elira replied quietly. "I know that you see her face in your dreams and wake each morning to the fresh realization that she is gone. I know that you have convinced yourself that being feared is safer than being loved, because love can be taken away." Thorne's intake of breath was sharp and audible, as if her words had struck him like physical blows. She heard him move to the window, his boots heavy on the stone floor, and knew that he was struggling with emotions he had kept locked away for so long that he had forgotten how to feel them. "What are you?" he asked again, and this time the question carried no threat, only a desperate need to understand. "I am what my people call an Omega," Elira said. "One who sees the truth of hearts and souls. It is a gift that comes with great cost. For once you have seen the pain that lives within others, you can never unsee it. And what do you see when you look at me now?" She was quiet for a long moment, reaching out with senses that still ached from their earlier overload. What she found there in the space between them was not the cold emptiness she had expected, but something far more complex and vulnerable. "I see a man standing at a crossroads," she said finally. "One path leads back to the familiar darkness where you have lived for so long. The other leads toward something unknown but not necessarily fearsome. The choice is yours to make." When he turned back to face her, she could feel the change in his emotional landscape, like a shift in the wind before a storm. Something had cracked in his carefully constructed defenses, letting in the first tentative rays of light he had allowed himself to feel in 15 years. "You will remain in the castle," he said. But it was not a command so much as a request wrapped in royal authority. "Lady Morgana will see to your needs, and you will not be required to work in the kitchens any longer. Thank you." "Your Majesty," she said. Inclining her head in acknowledgement of his kindness, he paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame as if he were reluctant to leave. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might have been hope. "Perhaps tomorrow you would join me for the evening meal. I find myself curious about these truths you claim to see." And with that, he was gone, leaving Elira alone with the echoes of words that had changed everything between them, and the growing certainty that her presence in this castle was no accident of fate, but the beginning of something that would transform them both in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The invitation to dine with the king came as a shock to the entire castle, rippling through the corridors like wildfire, carried on whispered conversations and meaningful glances. In 15 years of brutal rule, Thorne had never once invited anyone to share his evening meal, preferring the solitude of his private chambers to the forced pleasantries of courtly dining. That he had extended such an honor to a blind peasant woman from a conquered province defied all logic and precedent. Lady Morgana took charge of preparing Elira for the unprecedented occasion, producing a gown of deep blue wool from her own wardrobe, simple but well made, with silver threading at the cuffs that caught the candlelight like captured starlight. As the healer helped her dress, Elira could feel the woman's curiosity radiating from her like heat from a forge. "In all my years at court," Morgana said while braiding Elira's dark hair into an elegant pattern, "I have never seen our king show such interest in another person. You have accomplished in 1 week what dozens of ambitious noble ladies have failed to achieve in 15 years. "I have no designs on the throne," Elira replied quietly, her fingers tracing the unfamiliar richness of the gown's fabric. "I seek only to understand." "Understanding can be more dangerous than ambition," Morgana observed, with the wisdom of someone who had survived decades of court intrigue. "Be careful that your gift for seeing truth does not blind you to the dangers that surround you here." When the appointed hour arrived, Elira found herself escorted through corridors she had never seen before, up a winding staircase to the king's private study. The room was smaller than she had expected, dominated by a massive fireplace that filled the space with dancing light and welcome warmth. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their leather bindings releasing the scent of knowledge accumulated over generations. Maps covered a large table in the center of the room, their surfaces marked with colored pins and notations in Thorne's careful script. The king himself stood with his back to the door, gazing into the fire as if seeking answers in its flames. He had changed from his usual black leather into a simple tunic of deep red, and his hair was neatly combed back from his face. When he turned to greet her, Elira was struck once again by the contradiction between his fearsome reputation and the man she sensed beneath it, wounded, yes, and hardened by years of necessary cruelty, but not yet entirely lost to the darkness. "Welcome," he said, gesturing toward a chair positioned near the fire. "I trust Lady Morgana has seen to your comfort." "She has been most kind," Elira replied, settling into the offered seat with careful grace. "As have you, Your Majesty. I'm grateful for your hospitality." A servant appeared as if by magic, setting plates of food before them, roasted meat, fresh bread, and vegetables prepared with herbs that made Elira's mouth water despite her nervousness. She had not eaten a proper meal since her arrival at the castle. Subsisting on the simple fare provided to the kitchen staff, they ate in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the soft clink of utensils against plates. Elira could feel Thorne watching her, his gaze intense and searching, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that had been troubling him for days. "You said you see truth," he said finally, setting down his cup of wine with deliberate care. "What does that mean exactly? How does one see what cannot be observed with the eyes?" Elira chose her words carefully, aware that she was treading on dangerous ground. "It is difficult to explain to those who do not share the gift. When I touch someone, or when they touch me, I become aware of their essential nature, their fears, their hopes, their deepest secrets. It is not a choice I make, but rather something that happens whether I will it or not." "That sounds more like a curse than a blessing," Thorne observed, his voice carrying a note of sympathy that surprised them both. "It can be," she admitted. "There are times when I would gladly trade this sight for the simple blindness of the flesh. To know the truth of every heart you encounter is to carry the weight of the world's pain upon your shoulders." "Yet you spoke of seeing good in me," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Surely that was mistaken. There has been no good in me for many years." Elira turned toward him, her clouded eyes seeming to focus directly on his face with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably in his chair. "You are wrong, Your Majesty. The good is still there, buried beneath layers of grief and guilt, but not destroyed. I felt it when you caught me from falling. I see it now in your willingness to question your own nature." "You see what you wish to see," he said, but there was no conviction in his denial. "I have ruled through fear and violence. I have executed men for lesser crimes than speaking to me as freely as you do now. What good could possibly remain in such a creature? The same good that made you a beloved prince before tragedy struck," Elira said gently. "The same heart that loved your queen with such devotion that her loss nearly destroyed you. Love that deep does not simply vanish, Your Majesty. It transforms, sometimes into something darker, but the capacity for it remains." Thorne was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if its flames might reveal secrets he had forgotten. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Tell me about her. What you saw when you touched me. Tell me about Lyanna." The request was so unexpected, so vulnerable, that Elira felt her heart clench with sympathy. In 15 years, no one had dared speak his dead queen's name in his presence, and she could sense how much it cost him to voice it now. "She was light itself," Elira said softly, drawing on the visions that had flooded her consciousness during their contact. Golden-haired and quick to laugh, with eyes the color of summer sky. She saw the best in everyone she met, including you. When she looked at you, she saw not a future king, but the man who would read poetry to her in the garden and bring her wildflowers picked from the meadows beyond the castle walls. Thorne's breath caught audibly, and she could feel the waves of pain and longing radiating from him like heat from a forge. But beneath the anguish was something else, relief, perhaps, at finally being able to speak of the woman who had shaped his heart. "She wanted children," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "A daughter with her eyes and a son to carry on the line. She used to plan their nursery while she sat by this very fire, describing the tapestries she would hang and the stories she would tell them. And she would have been a wonderful mother," Elira said with complete certainty. "But her greatest gift was in loving you so completely that she awakened the best parts of your nature. That love did not die with her, Your Majesty. It lives on in you, waiting to be remembered." "You speak of things that feel like dreams now," Thorne said, but his tone had lost its earlier harshness. "I can barely remember what it felt like to be that man." "Then perhaps it is time to remember," Elira suggested quietly. "Not to forget the pain of your loss, for that would dishonor her memory, but to recall that you were once capable of great love and might be so again." The suggestion hung in the air between them, like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Thorne rose from his chair and moved to one of the bookcases, his fingers tracing the spine of a leather-bound volume with obvious familiarity. "She loved poetry," he said, pulling the book from its place and cradling it in his hands like a sacred relic. "This was her favorite collection. I have not opened it since the day she died. Would you read something from it?" Elira asked gently. "I think she would like that." For a moment she thought he might refuse, that the suggestion had pushed too far, too fast. But then he opened the book with trembling fingers, pages rustling like autumn leaves as he found the passage he sought. "Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds," he read, his voice growing stronger with each word, "or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken." The words filled the room with their ancient wisdom, and Elira could feel something shifting in the space between them, as if the very air had become charged with possibility. Thorne closed the book gently, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "She marked that passage," he said quietly. "Said it reminded her of us, and she was right," Elira replied. "Your love for her has never altered, never bent or broken, despite all the tempests you have faced. It remains as fixed and constant as the North Star." They sat in comfortable silence for a time, the fire crackling softly between them while the shadows danced on the walls. Elira could sense the change taking place within Thorne, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. The walls he had built around his heart were still there, but hairline cracks had appeared in their surface, letting in the first tentative warmth he had allowed himself to feel in years. "Why are you here?" he asked suddenly. "Not just in this room, but in my castle, in my kingdom. What brought you to Ethros?" The question caught her off guard, though she realized she should have expected it. Thorne was no fool, despite his reputation for preferring violence to diplomacy, and he would naturally be suspicious of anyone who arrived bearing gifts that seemed too convenient to be mere coincidence. "I was born there," she said carefully, sticking as close to the truth as possible. "My gift manifested when I was very young, and the people of my village believed I had been touched by the gods. When your armies conquered the province, Lord Baelor sought counsel about what tribute might appease you. The village elders suggested that one such as I might be of value to a king. It was not entirely a lie, though it omitted the crucial details that would have seen her executed on the spot." Thorne studied her with those penetrating grey eyes, and she could feel him weighing her words against his instincts. "And you agreed to this arrangement willingly?" he pressed. "To be given away like a piece of property to a king known for his cruelty? I had little choice in the matter," Elira replied honestly. "But I confess I was curious about the man whose reputation had spread even to our remote province. The stories painted you as a monster, yet something in my heart whispered that there might be more to the tale." "Your heart was either very wise or very foolish," Thorne said with a bitter smile. "Time will tell which." The evening passed more quickly than either of them had anticipated, filled with careful conversation that danced around the edges of deeper truths. Thorne spoke of his kingdom's history, of the challenges of ruling 7 provinces with different customs and languages. Elira shared tales of her village, carefully edited to avoid any mention of prophecies or secret missions. As the fire burned low and the hour grew late, Thorne escorted her personally back to her chambers, a gesture that would have sent fresh rumors racing through the castle had anyone been awake to witness it. At her door, he paused, his hand resting on the frame in a gesture that was becoming familiar. "Would you join me again tomorrow evening?" he asked, and there was something almost vulnerable in his tone. "I find myself curious about your perspective on matters of statecraft." "It would be my honor, Your Majesty," Elira replied, though she could hear the slight breathlessness in her own voice as she settled into her narrow bed. Elira reflected on the evening's revelations. She had seen glimpses of the man Thorne had once been, and more importantly, she had felt his response to her presence, a gradual awakening of emotions he had thought permanently buried. The mission she had been sent to accomplish seemed increasingly impossible, not because she lacked the means to carry it out, but because she was beginning to understand that the man she had been sent to destroy might be worth saving instead. In his own chambers high above, Thorne stood once again at his window, but for the first time in years, he was not thinking solely of the past. The blind woman's words echoed in his mind, challenging assumptions he had held as sacred truths for 15 years. Could it be possible that the capacity for love still lived within his scarred heart? Could the man Lyanna had cherished truly be recalled from the grave where he had buried him? The questions troubled his sleep, but they were not the nightmares that usually plagued his rest. Instead, they were the first stirrings of hope, fragile as spring flowers pushing through winter soil, but real nonetheless. And in her chamber below, Elira smiled in her sleep, dreaming not of the mission that had brought her here, but of grey eyes that had looked at her with something approaching trust. The following evening brought another invitation, and then another, until their private dinners became an established ritual that set tongues wagging throughout the castle. Gareth watched his king's transformation with growing unease, noting the subtle changes that marked Thorne's gradual emergence from the emotional tomb he had constructed around himself. The perpetual scowl that had marked his features for 15 years softened into something approaching contemplation. His morning judgments, while still swift and decisive, carried less of the casual cruelty that had once made grown men weep with terror. Lord Aldrich, ever the opportunist, began to probe the situation with the delicate precision of a surgeon seeking an artery. He arranged for coincidental encounters in corridors, offering observations about the kingdom's affairs while watching carefully for any sign of weakness he might exploit. The king's newfound interest in mercy troubled him deeply, for a compassionate ruler was far more difficult to manipulate than a tyrant driven by rage and grief. Lady Morgana observed the unfolding drama with the detached interest of a scholar studying some fascinating new phenomenon. Her healer's instincts told her that whatever was happening between the king and the mysterious woman from Ethros was having a profound effect on both of them. Thorne's chronic insomnia was improving, his appetite had returned, and the dark circles beneath his eyes were beginning to fade. During their 5th evening together, Thorne made a decision that surprised even himself. As they finished their meal in comfortable silence, he rose from his chair and moved to a cabinet that had remained locked for 15 years. "There is something I would like to show you," he said, his voice carrying an uncertainty that would have amazed his court. From the cabinet, he withdrew an ornate silver music box, its surface tarnished with age but still beautiful in the firelight. Elira sensed the significance of the moment immediately, her supernatural perception picking up the waves of emotion that surrounded the object like incense around an altar. "It was hers," she said softly, not needing to specify whose it had been. "A wedding gift from her father," Thorne confirmed, settling back into his chair with the music box cradled in his hands like a holy relic. She would wind it each evening before bed, and the melody would follow me into sleep. "I have not heard it since the night she died. Would you play it now?" Elira asked gently, sensing how much the gesture would mean to his healing process. Thorne's fingers hesitated over the small key, trembling slightly with the weight of memory and possibility. Then, with deliberate care, he wound the mechanism and lifted the lid. The melody that emerged was hauntingly beautiful, a simple tune that spoke of love and loss and the bittersweet nature of all mortal joy. The music filled the room like a blessing, and Elira watched through her supernatural sight as something fundamental shifted within Thorne's spirit. The armor of grief that had encased his heart for so long cracked open just a little wider, letting in more light than he had felt in years. "It's beautiful," she whispered, and was surprised to find tears running down her cheeks. "She said it reminded her of our first dance," Thorne said, his own voice thick with emotion. "At the harvest festival in Rosemere, before we were married. She was wearing a dress the color of autumn leaves, and when the musicians struck up this tune, she pulled me onto the dancing floor despite my protest that I had 2 left feet." "Did you?" Elira asked with a small smile. "Have 2 left feet?" "Absolutely," Thorne replied, and for the first time in their acquaintance she heard him laugh, a rusty sound, as if the mechanism had not been used in so long that it required oil to function properly. "I stepped on her toes at least 6 times, but she never complained, just kept smiling and guiding me through the steps until I stopped thinking so hard about where my feet were supposed to go." The music box played its tune 3 times before winding down, and in the silence that followed, both of them seemed to understand that something irreversible had occurred. A door that had been sealed shut for 15 years had been opened, and there was no going back to the way things had been. "Thank you," Thorne said quietly, though whether he was speaking to Elira or to the memory of his dead queen was unclear. "I had forgotten how much joy that sound could bring." "Music has a way of preserving our happiest moments," Elira observed. "Your wife knew that when she chose to make it part of her nightly ritual. She was giving you a gift that would outlast her physical presence." They spoke long into the night, their conversation meandering through topics both weighty and trivial. Thorne found himself sharing memories he had thought buried forever, stories of his childhood, his hopes for the kingdom before cynicism had taken root, his dreams of the family he and Lyanna had planned to build together. Elira listened with the patience of a confessor, offering gentle insights that helped him see his past in new ways. "I was not always like this," he said during a lull in their conversation, gesturing vaguely at himself as if his current nature were a garment he had put on and forgotten how to remove. Before Lyanna's death, I believed that kindness was strength, that a king's greatest power lay in inspiring loyalty rather than fear. You still believe that, Elira said with quiet certainty. Otherwise, you would not be questioning your methods now. But I have done such terrible things, Thorne protested, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years' worth of guilt. Executions ordered in anger, provinces crushed beneath the weight of impossible taxes, advisors dismissed or worse, simply for offering counsel I did not wish to hear. How does one atone for such a legacy? By choosing a different path moving forward, Elira replied simply. The past cannot be changed, but the future remains unwritten. Every day offers a new opportunity to become the man you were meant to be. And if I have forgotten how to be that man, then you learn again, one day at a time, one decision at a time. Redemption is not a destination, but a journey, and it begins with the simple choice to try. On the 7th evening of their dinners, Thorne made another unprecedented decision. As they concluded their meal, he rose from his chair and offered her his arm. "Would you care to see the garden?" he asked, his tone carefully casual despite the significance of the invitation. Elira's heart raced as she accepted his escort, knowing instinctively that he was sharing something precious with her. They walked through corridors she had never explored, past tapestries and portraits that spoke of the castle's long history, until they reached a wooden door marked with an ornate key. This was Lyanna's private garden, Thorne explained, as he unlocked the door with hands that shook almost imperceptibly. No one has entered it since her death. I could not bear to tend it, but neither could I bring myself to let it be destroyed. The garden that lay beyond the door was a testament to the complex nature of grief and memory. Wild growth had reclaimed much of the space, but the underlying structure remained visible, carefully planned beds where roses and herbs had once grown in ordered profusion. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and mint that had survived the years of neglect, and a small fountain in the center still trickled with water. Though moss had claimed its carved edges, Elira moved through the space with reverent care, her fingers trailing over plants that had grown tall and wild in their abandonment. Despite the chaos of unchecked growth, she could sense the love that had once shaped this place, the gentle hands that had coaxed beauty from soil and seed. "She would sit here for hours," Thorne said, his voice soft with memory, "planning improvements, sketching designs for new beds. She said gardens were like kingdoms. They required patience, care, and the wisdom to know when to prune and when to let things grow wild." "She was wise," Elira murmured, settling onto a stone bench that sat beneath an arbor, now heavy with untamed vines. "And she would not want this place to remain a shrine to sorrow. She would want it to live again, to bring joy as it once did." Thorne sat beside her on the bench, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence without their bodies touching. In the growing dusk, surrounded by the scents and sounds of the abandoned garden, both of them felt the weight of possibility hanging in the air like morning mist. "I would not know where to begin," he admitted. "I have no skill with growing things. My hands know only how to destroy." "That is not true," Elira said firmly. "You have been gentle with me, patient with my questions, careful not to overwhelm me with your presence. Those are not the actions of a man who knows only destruction." As if to test her words, Thorne reached out slowly and touched her hand where it rested on the stone between them. The contact sent familiar shockwaves through her supernatural senses, but gentler this time, controlled and deliberate rather than the overwhelming flood of their first encounter. Through that touch, she felt his wonder at her presence in his life, his growing awareness that the walls around his heart were crumbling despite his best efforts to maintain them. But she also sensed his fear, terror that allowing himself to care again would only lead to more devastating loss. "I am afraid," he whispered, his admission carrying the weight of absolute truth. "Of what?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Of losing someone again. Of allowing my heart to heal only to have it broken more completely than before. I barely survived Lyanna's death. I could not endure such pain again. Elira turned toward him, her clouded eyes seeming to see directly into his soul. "Love always carries the risk of loss," she said gently. "But the alternative, to live without love, to let fear dictate the boundaries of your heart, is not truly living at all. It is merely existing, breathing without purpose, ruling without joy." They sat in silence as the first stars appeared overhead, their light reflecting in the still water of the fountain. Around them, night-blooming flowers released their fragrance into the cooling air, and somewhere in the distance, a nightingale began its evening song. "Would you help me?" Thorne asked suddenly, the words escaping him before he could reconsider their implications. "Help you with what?" "Restore this place. Bring it back to life." He paused, then added with quiet vulnerability, "I think she would like that. And I find myself wanting to create something beautiful instead of just maintaining order through fear." Elira's smile was radiant enough to light the darkening garden. "It would be my greatest honor, Your Majesty. Together, I believe we can make something wonderful grow here." As they walked back toward the castle, neither of them spoke of the deeper significance of their agreement, but both understood that they had committed to far more than gardening. They had chosen to nurture something fragile and precious that was growing between them, despite all the reasons why such a thing should be impossible. In the shadows of the garden wall, Sir Gareth watched their retreating figures with growing concern. The king's transformation was accelerating, and while part of him rejoiced to see his sovereign emerging from his long grief, another part recognized the dangers that such vulnerability might bring. Love, as he had learned through long experience, made even the strongest men weak, and weak kings rarely kept their crowns for long. High above in his tower study, Lord Aldrich plotted by candlelight, his mind turning over possibilities and schemes like a merchant counting coins. The blind woman's influence over the king was becoming impossible to ignore, and influence unchecked could quickly become power. Something would have to be done, and soon, before the situation spiraled beyond his ability to control. But in the garden they had left behind, the nightingale continued its song, and the ancient roses stirred in the evening breeze as if awakening from a long sleep. The restoration of Lyanna's garden became a daily ritual that transformed not only the neglected space, but the very rhythm of life within Drakmore Castle. Each morning after the court's business was concluded, Thorne would find Elira waiting by the garden door, her simple work dress protected by an apron borrowed from the kitchen, her dark hair bound back with practical efficiency. Together, they would spend hours clearing away the wild growth that had claimed the carefully planned beds, their hands working in harmony to reveal the garden's original design. Elira's supernatural senses proved invaluable in the work, allowing her to distinguish between weeds and the descendants of Lyanna's original plantings with an accuracy that amazed Thorne. She could sense the life force flowing through roots and stems, identifying which plants were thriving and which needed attention. Under her guidance, they uncovered rose bushes that had survived the years of neglect, their thorny branches reaching toward sunlight with stubborn determination. Your queen had excellent taste, Elira observed one afternoon as they worked to clear a bed of herbs that had grown into a miniature jungle. These plants were chosen not just for beauty, but for their healing properties. Lavender for calming the mind, chamomile for peaceful sleep, rosemary for remembrance. Thorne paused in his digging, a handful of weeds forgotten in his grasp. "She studied the healing arts with Lady Morgana before our marriage. Said a queen should know how to tend her people's bodies as well as their spirits." "Wise and compassionate," Elira murmured, her fingers gentle as she coaxed a struggling mint plant back to health. "She would be pleased to see you honoring her memory by bringing life back to this place." The physical work of restoration had an unexpected effect on both of them. For Thorne, the simple act of creating rather than destroying awakened muscles and instincts that had been dormant for years. His hands, so accustomed to wielding sword and scepter, learned again the satisfaction of coaxing beauty from soil and seed. For Elira, the garden became a sanctuary where she could lower her supernatural defenses and simply exist in the moment, surrounded by the honest growth of living things. Their conversations during these working hours ranged across topics both profound and mundane. Thorne spoke of his childhood dreams, his early hopes for the kingdom, and the gradual erosion of his idealism under the weight of responsibility and loss. Elira shared carefully edited stories of her own past, painting a picture of a simple village life that bore little resemblance to the complex truth of her origins and purpose. As the days passed, their relationship deepened beyond the formal boundaries of king and subject. Thorne found himself watching for her smile when he made an observation that amused her, treasuring the sound of her laughter when he accidentally uprooted a plant he had meant to save. Elira, in turn, began to see past the fearsome reputation to the man beneath, intelligent, wounded, but possessed of a fundamental goodness that had never been truly destroyed, despite 15 years of burial. The court watched these developments with varying degrees of fascination and alarm. Zagareth maintained his loyal silence, but grew increasingly troubled by what he saw as his king's dangerous vulnerability. The other nobles whispered among themselves, some viewing Elira as a harmless distraction that might soften their ruler's harsher edges, others seeing her as a potential threat to the established order. Lord Aldrich's concerns ran deeper than mere court gossip. He had built his power on his ability to predict and influence Thorne's moods, using the king's grief and isolation as tools to advance his own agenda. A healed and happy monarch would be far more difficult to manipulate, and the advisor found himself taking increasingly desperate measures to maintain his position. The first assassination attempt came on an evening when autumn mist had settled over the castle like a grey shroud. Thorne and Elira had worked late in the garden, reluctant to abandon their restoration project as the growing season drew toward its close. As they walked back toward the castle, their hands dirty with soil and their conversation easy with shared accomplishment, 3 cloaked figures emerged from the shadows between the garden wall and the main keep. Elira sensed the malevolent intent before the attackers even drew their weapons, her supernatural perception picking up the murderous emotions that radiated from them like heat from a forge. "Danger!" she whispered urgently, her hand catching Thorne's arm just as the first assassin lunged forward with a curved dagger aimed at the king's heart. Thorne's warrior instincts, dormant but never truly lost, exploded into action. He pulled Elira behind him with one hand while drawing his sword with the other, the familiar weight of steel in his grip, awakening reflexes honed through decades of combat. The first attacker's blade met his with a ringing clash that echoed off the castle walls, sparks flying from the contact of steel on steel. The fight was brief, but vicious. Thorne had not survived 15 years of rule without considerable skill at arms, and the surprise attack had awakened all of his deadly expertise. The first assassin fell with his throat opened by a precise cut that sent blood spraying across the garden wall. The second tried to circle around to reach Elira, but found his path blocked by a king whose protective fury exceeded even his legendary rage. The third attacker, seeing his companions fall, turned to flee, but found his escape blocked by Sir Gareth and a squad of guards who had been drawn by the sounds of combat. The would-be assassin was taken alive, though badly wounded, his capture ensuring that answers might be forthcoming about who had dared to strike at the crown. In the aftermath of the attack, as the bodies were carried away and the captured assassin dragged to the dungeons for questioning, Thorne found himself shaking not with fear, but with the realization of how close he had come to losing something precious. He had faced death many times in his life, but the thought that Elira might have been harmed in the attack filled him with a terror unlike anything he had ever experienced. "Are you injured?" he asked for the third time, his hands checking her arms and shoulders for wounds, despite her repeated assurances that she was unharmed. "I am well," she said gently, her own hands coming up to cover his and still their anxious movement. "You protected me. I was never in any real danger. You saved my life," he countered, his voice rough with emotion. Without your warning, that first blade would have found its mark before I could react. They stood together in the garden they had been restoring, surrounded by the lingering scent of violence and the more familiar fragrance of lavender and roses. In the moonlight, Elira could see the truth written across Thorne's face, as clearly as if it had been illuminated by supernatural sight. He was falling in love with her, and the knowledge terrified him more than any assassin's blade. "Your Majesty," she began, but he silenced her with a gentle finger pressed to her lips. "Thorne," he said quietly, "in this garden, away from the throne and crown, just call me Thorne." The simplicity of the request carried enormous weight, marking a boundary crossed and a distance closed that could never be undone. When Elira spoke his name for the first time, her voice soft with wonder at the intimacy of it, Thorne felt something inside his chest crack open like an egg releasing new life. The interrogation of the captured assassin proved frustratingly inconclusive. Under Lady Morgana's skilled application of truth serums and Sir Gareth's more direct methods of questioning, the man revealed that he and his companions had been hired through intermediaries, paid in gold by someone who had covered their tracks with meticulous care. The assassin knew nothing of his employer's identity beyond the fact that they wanted both the king and the blind woman dead. Professional killers, Sir Gareth reported grimly during the emergency council session that followed. Well-trained and well-paid, but ultimately expendable. Whoever hired them expected them to die in the attempt, which suggests someone with considerable resources and a sophisticated understanding of how such operations function, Lord Aldrich observed, his tone carefully neutral, despite the accusation that hung unspoken in the air. Thorne studied his chief advisor with those penetrating grey eyes, weighing possibilities and motives with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through 15 years of dangerous rule. "Indeed," he said quietly, "someone with intimate knowledge of castle security and my personal routines. Someone who would benefit from my death and had reason to fear my recent changes in temperament." The threat hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread, but Aldrich's expression remained carefully composed. "I can think of several foreign powers who might wish your Majesty harm," he said smoothly. "Perhaps we should increase security and investigate possible agents among the castle staff." "Perhaps we should," Thorne agreed. But his tone carried layers of meaning that made every man in the room shift uncomfortably in his seat. The assassination attempt marked a turning point in more ways than one. Thorne's protective instincts, once focused solely on preserving his own power, expanded to encompass Elira's safety with an intensity that surprised him. He assigned additional guards to watch over her, moved her quarters to chambers closer to his own, and found himself checking on her welfare multiple times throughout each day. More significantly, the attack forced him to confront the depth of his feelings for the blind woman who had appeared so unexpectedly in his life. The terror he had felt at the possibility of losing her was unlike anything he had experienced since Lyanna's death, and it forced him to acknowledge what his heart had been trying to tell him for weeks. "I am falling in love with you," he confessed one evening as they sat by the fire in his study, the words escaping him like prisoners breaking free from a long captivity. Elira's hands stilled on the needlework she had been using to occupy her fingers during their conversations. The admission hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, fraught with possibilities and dangers that neither of them could fully foresee. "I know," she said quietly, her supernatural perception having made his growing feelings impossible to miss. "And I must confess that my own heart has been similarly affected." "This is impossible," Thorne said, but there was no conviction in his protest. "You are a subject, I am a king. You are from a conquered province, I am the conqueror. The distance between us is too great to bridge." "Distance is a matter of choice, not circumstance," Elira replied, setting aside her needlework to turn toward him with her full attention. "Hearts recognize no boundaries of rank or birth. They know only the truth of connection, the reality of recognition, the simple fact of one soul calling to another." "And if I choose to bridge that distance?" Thorne asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What then?" How does a king love someone without destroying them in the process? Carefully, Elira said with a smile that transformed her entire face. Gently, with the patience and devotion you have shown to your garden. Love is not so different from growing things. It requires time, attention, and the wisdom to know when to protect and when to allow growth. They move toward each other with the slow deliberation of planets aligning, drawn by forces too fundamental to resist. When Thorne's lips finally met hers, the kiss carried all the tender hesitancy of first love, combined with the desperate hunger of hearts too long denied. Elira's supernatural senses exploded with the contact, flooding her consciousness with the full depth of his emotions. Love, yes, but also fear, hope, and a vulnerability so complete it took her breath away. When they finally broke apart, both of them shaking with the intensity of what had passed between them. Thorne rested his forehead against hers and spoke the words that would seal both their fates. I love you, Elira of Ethros. Whatever the consequences, whatever the cost, I love you with all that remains of my heart. And I love you, Thorne of Drakmor, she whispered back, her voice carrying the weight of absolute truth, despite the secrets that still lay hidden in her past. I love the man you were, the king you have become, and the person you are growing into with each passing day. Outside their sanctuary of warmth and firelight, the castle slept uneasily beneath autumn stars. In the dungeons, interrogators worked through the night, seeking answers that would not come. In the shadows of the courtyard, additional guards walked their rounds with heightened vigilance. And in a tower chamber overlooking the garden where love had taken root among the restored roses, Lord Aldrich sat at his desk, composing letters that would set in motion events beyond anyone's ability to control. The game was entering a new phase, and the stakes had just become infinitely higher. The ravens began arriving 3 days after the failed assassination attempt, their black wings cutting through the grey autumn sky like harbingers of approaching storm. Each bird carried messages that painted an increasingly troubling picture of unrest throughout the 7 kingdoms. Reports that landed on Thorne's desk with the weight of accumulating thunder. The first report came from the eastern provinces, where tax collectors had been found murdered on remote country roads. Their strongboxes emptied and their bodies left as warnings to those who would serve the crown. The second arrived from the southern marshlands, detailing the mysterious disappearance of an entire garrison stationed at a strategic river crossing. By the 4th day, Sir Gareth was laying out a map of the kingdom on the war table, marking each incident with red pins that clustered like drops of blood across the parchment. The pattern is clear. Your Majesty, the captain reported grimly. Coordinated strikes designed to test our response times and gauge the loyalty of local populations. This is not random banditry, this is preparation for something larger. Thorne studied the map with the cold focus that had made him a formidable military commander before. Grief had consumed his strategic thinking. The incidents formed a rough circle around Drakmor itself, suggesting that whoever was orchestrating the rebellion had intimate knowledge of the kingdom's defensive structures and supply lines. What of Lord Baelor? He asked, noting the suspicious absence of any reports from Ethros province. No word from his lands in over a fortnight, Sir Gareth confirmed. Our usual informants have gone silent, and the merchants who trade through that region report increased military activity along the main roads. Increased activity of what nature? Armed men moving in small groups, supplies being stockpiled in fortified positions, and most concerning of all, recruitment efforts among the local population. There are rumors that Baelor is calling in old debts and older alliances. Thorne's jaw tightened as the implications became clear. Baelor had submitted to conquest with suspicious ease 6 months ago, accepting defeat and occupation without the prolonged resistance that had marked the subjugation of other provinces. At the time, Thorne had attributed this to pragmatic acceptance of overwhelming force. But now it seemed more likely that the Lord had been buying time to prepare a more sophisticated response. Double the watch on all approaches to the castle, Thorne commanded. Send messengers to our loyal governors. I want detailed reports on troop movements and supply situations. And increase the guard on—" He paused, unwilling to voice his deepest concern in front of the assembled council. "On the Lady Elira," Sir Gareth finished diplomatically. "It shall be done, Your Majesty." The war council that followed stretched deep into the night, filled with debates over troop deployments and defensive strategies. Lord Aldrich argued for a preemptive strike against Ethros, suggesting that crushing Baelor quickly would discourage other provinces from joining any rebellion. Other advisors counseled patience, recommending a defensive posture that would force the rebels to come to them on ground of their choosing. Thorne listened to each argument with careful attention, but his mind kept returning to a more personal concern. If Baelor was indeed orchestrating a rebellion, what did that mean for Elira's presence in the castle? Had she been placed here as part of some elaborate scheme, or was she simply an innocent caught between forces beyond her control? The questions troubled his sleep and followed him into the garden the next morning, where Elira waited with her usual serenity despite the obvious increase in security around the castle. She had noticed the additional guards, the hurried conferences, and the tension that seemed to crackle through the air like lightning before a storm. "Trouble approaches," she said simply, as they began their daily work among the roses, her supernatural senses picking up the currents of anxiety that flowed through the castle like an underground river. "Yes," Thorne confirmed, finding comfort in her straightforward acknowledgement of the situation. "It seems your former lord has been busy making alliances and gathering forces. We may be facing a siege before winter sets in properly." Elira's hands stilled on the rosebush she had been pruning, and for a moment her careful composure slipped enough to reveal the depth of her concern. "Lord Baelor is not a man to act rashly," she said carefully. "If he is moving against you, he believes he has sufficient cause and support to succeed. You know him well?" Thorne asked, his tone carefully neutral despite the undercurrent of suspicion that had begun to plague his thoughts. "Well enough," Elira replied, her voice carrying the weight of complicated history. "He is my kinsman after a fashion. My village falls under his protection, and I have served in his household on occasion." The admission hit Thorne like a physical blow, though he struggled to keep his reaction from showing on his face. A kinsman, someone with personal connections to the woman he had come to love. Someone who might have reasons beyond simple rebellion for wanting to reclaim what had been taken from him. "Elira," Thorne said quietly, setting down his pruning shears and turning to face her fully. "I must ask you something, and I need you to answer with complete honesty." She raised her head, her clouded eyes seeming to focus directly on his face with that uncanny accuracy that always unsettled him. "Ask what you will. I have never lied to you. Are you here by choice, or are you here as part of some larger plan? When Baelor brought you to my court, was it truly as tribute, or was there another purpose behind your presence?" The question hung between them like a sword poised to fall, and Thorne could see the internal struggle playing out across Elira's features. Her supernatural gift made deception nearly impossible for her to maintain, but he could sense that there were truths she had been holding back, secrets that went to the very heart of who she was and why she had come to Drakmor. "The situation is more complex than it first appeared," she said finally, her voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of the admission. "Yes, there was another purpose to my presence here, one that Baelor and my people hoped would serve their needs. But Thorne—" She reached out to touch his hand, her fingers urgent against his skin. "Whatever the original intent, whatever plans may have been made, my feelings for you are real. The love that has grown between us is not part of any deception." Thorne pulled his hand away from her touch, the withdrawal causing them both visible pain. "What purpose?" he demanded, his voice carrying the cold authority that had made grown warriors tremble. "What were you sent here to accomplish?" "I was sent to assess you," Elira said quietly, the words coming with obvious reluctance. "To use my gifts to understand your true nature, to determine whether you were the monster your reputation painted you to be or something else entirely. My people believe in an ancient prophecy about the Alpha King and the Omega, who would either destroy or redeem him. And what was your assessment? Thorne asked, though part of him dreaded the answer, that you are a man wounded by loss, hardened by necessity, but not evil by nature. That beneath the crown and the fear you inspire, there lives someone capable of great love and wisdom. That redemption is not only possible, but already begun. Yet you said, either destroy or redeem, Thorne pressed. What was the original plan if you had found me to be the monster they expected? Elira's silence stretched long enough to become an answer in itself, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. There are certain capabilities that come with my gifts, ways that one who sees truth can influence the hearts and minds of others. If you had proven to be irredeemably evil, if your rule had been based purely on cruelty, with no hope of change, then yes, I could have ended the threat you posed to my people. The revelation struck Thorne like a physical blow, not just because of its implications, but because of the pain it revealed. She had been sent here as an assassin, armed with supernatural weapons he could barely comprehend, yet she had chosen instead to see the good in him and nurture it back to life. Why didn't you? He asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Complete your mission, I mean. You certainly had opportunity enough. Because within days of arriving, I realized that the man my people feared did not truly exist. Elira replied, tears running freely down her cheeks now. Yes, you had done terrible things, made harsh decisions, ruled through fear and intimidation. But at your core, you were simply someone who had forgotten how to hope, how to trust, how to love. And I found that I could not destroy someone whose greatest crime was surviving the loss of everything that mattered to him. Thorne stood abruptly, pacing to the far side of the garden as he struggled to process what he had learned. The woman he loved had been sent to kill him. She possessed abilities he didn't fully understand, served loyalties he had never suspected, and had been deceiving him from the moment they met. Yet despite all of that, he could feel the truth of her love radiating from her like heat from a forge. Her emotions were as transparent to him as his were to her supernatural perception. And what he sensed, there was genuine anguish at the pain her revelations were causing him. The rebellion, he said suddenly, the pieces of a larger puzzle falling into place in his mind. Baylor is moving now because you have not completed your mission. He expected me to be dead by this point, the kingdom thrown into chaos and confusion, ripe for reconquest. Most likely, Elira confirmed miserably. Though I suspect he has contingency plans that do not depend on my success or failure, such as he has been cultivating alliances for years, building a network of lords who chafe under your rule or remember the old ways with nostalgia. He is patient and careful, willing to wait for the right moment to strike when victory seems assured. Thorne turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. And yet you sit in my garden, warning me of his plans, helping me understand the forces arrayed against me. Why would you betray your own people for someone you were sent to kill? Because they are no longer my people, Elira said with quiet intensity. Because somewhere in these past weeks, my loyalty shifted from the mission to the man. Because I have seen what we could build together, not just in this garden, but in this kingdom. And I believe it would be something worth preserving, even if it means choosing me over them. Even if it means your own people will consider you a traitor. Even then, she confirmed without hesitation, love requires choices, Thorne. And I choose you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and possibility. Thorne could feel the crossroads moment approaching, the choice that would define not just their relationship, but the future of his kingdom. Before he could respond, the sound of running feet interrupted their conversation. Sir Gareth appeared at the garden entrance, his face grim with news that could not wait for a more convenient moment. Your Majesty, he called urgently, you must come at once. We have received a formal declaration of war from Lord Baylor, and there are reports of armies massing at 3 different points around our borders. The siege will begin within days. Thorne looked at Elira one last time, seeing in her face the same terrible recognition that filled his own heart. The time for gentle conversations and careful courtship had ended. War was coming to Drakmor, and with it would come choices that would test every bond they had forged and every truth they had discovered about themselves. "We will continue this discussion later," he said quietly, his tone carrying the weight of unfinished business and unresolved feelings. "Yes," Elira agreed, though both of them understood that the war would change everything, and the people who emerged from it might be too different from who they were now to reclaim what they had begun to build together. As they walked back toward the castle, the autumn wind picked up the scent of approaching rain and the distant sound of war horns echoing across the mountains. Behind them, the garden they had restored together caught the last rays of autumn sunlight, its roses blooming in defiance of the gathering storm, a testament to the possibility of beauty persisting even in the shadow of approaching darkness. The war council convened before dawn, the great hall illuminated by torches that cast dancing shadows across maps and faces grave with impending conflict. Reports had been arriving throughout the night, 3 separate armies converging on Drakmor from different directions, their combined force numbering nearly 10,000 men. It was a coordinated assault that spoke of months of careful planning and significant resources. Thorne stood at the head of the council table, his bearing once again that of the feared warrior king his enemies remembered. The tender man who had shared quiet evenings with a blind woman seemed to have retreated behind armor of cold calculation and strategic necessity. His grey eyes moved across the assembled faces, Sir Gareth with his weathered loyalty, Lord Aldrich with his calculating opportunism, Lady Morgana with her quiet wisdom, and a dozen other nobles whose allegiances would be tested in the coming conflict. "Sir Gareth, what are our defensive capabilities?" Thorne asked, his voice carrying the crisp authority of a commander who had faced impossible odds before. "We have 800 men within the castle walls, Your Majesty, with perhaps half that number again scattered among the outlying fortifications. Our stores are adequate for a siege of several months, and the castle's position makes direct assault costly for any attacker." "Not enough," Lord Aldrich interjected smoothly. 10,000 men could maintain a siege indefinitely while sending raiding parties to ravage the countryside. We should consider negotiation. Perhaps terms could be reached that would preserve the kingdom, even if certain accommodations must be made. Thorne's stare fixed on his chief advisor with laser intensity. "What manner of accommodations did you have in mind, Lord Aldrich?" "Merely that flexibility in leadership might prevent unnecessary bloodshed," Aldrich replied carefully. "If Lord Baelor's grievances could be addressed through diplomatic means such as my abdication. The kingdom's welfare must come before any individual's pride, even a king's," Aldrich said, his tone carrying just enough deference to avoid outright treason, while making his position clear. Before Thorne could respond to this barely veiled suggestion of surrender, the great doors of the hall burst open with a thunderous crash. Sir Gareth's hand flew to his sword hilt as armed figures strode into the chamber, but he held his position when he recognized the man leading them. Lord Baelor of Ethros entered with the bearing of a conqueror, flanked by 6 knights in the brown and gold livery of his house. He was a man in his early 50s, his greying beard meticulously groomed, and his armor polished to mirror brightness, despite the long ride that had brought him here. His eyes, pale blue and calculating, swept the assembled council before settling on Thorne with the satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. "Lord Baelor," Thorne said with deadly calm, making no move to rise from his chair. "How unexpected, and how remarkably convenient that you should arrive just as we were discussing the armies gathering at our borders." "Your Majesty," Baelor replied with a bow that managed to be technically correct while conveying absolute contempt. "I come under a flag of truce to offer terms that might spare us all considerable bloodshed." "How thoughtful of you," Thorne observed. "And what terms might those be?" Baelor smiled, the expression carrying no warmth whatsoever. "Unconditional surrender, immediate abdication, and the transfer of the crown to a more suitable ruler. In exchange, your life will be spared." though you will naturally be required to live in comfortable exile far from these lands." The audacity of the demand sent murmurs of shock and outrage through the assembled nobles. But Thorne merely leaned back in his chair and studied Baylor with the detached interest of a scientist examining an interesting specimen. "And who, precisely, did you have in mind as this more suitable ruler?" he asked. "A coalition of lords who remember the old ways," Baylor replied smoothly. "Men who understand that a kingdom should be governed with wisdom and restraint rather than fear and brutality." "I see. And this coalition, I assume, would be led by someone with considerable experience in the art of governance. Indeed, someone who has proven his ability to manage complex political situations and maintain stability even under the most challenging circumstances, such as orchestrating a rebellion while maintaining the pretense of loyalty." Baylor's smile widened. "Such as recognizing when a ruler has outlived his usefulness and taking appropriate action to preserve the greater good." Thorne rose slowly from his chair, his movement causing every guard in the room to tense with anticipation. "Your terms are noted and rejected. You have 1 hour to withdraw your forces to a distance of 10 miles from this castle, or I will consider this parley an act of war." "I'm afraid that will not be possible," Baylor replied with regret that was obviously false. "You see, the situation has evolved beyond simple military considerations. There are other factors at play that make your surrender not merely advisable, but inevitable." As if summoned by his words, 2 more figures entered the hall, guards escorting a woman in traveling clothes whose presence sent a shock through the assembled company. It was Elira, but not as anyone in the castle had ever seen her. Gone was the simple brown dress and humble demeanor. Instead, she wore robes of deep blue silk embroidered with silver symbols that seemed to shift and flow in the torchlight. Around her neck hung a crystal pendant that pulsed with soft inner light, and her clouded eyes blazed with power that made the air around her shimmer like heat waves. "Elira?" Thorne's voice carried a note of confused betrayal that cut through the formal atmosphere of the council like a blade. "Not merely Elira," Baylor said with obvious satisfaction. "Allow me to present the Lady Elira of the Sacred Grove, last daughter of the true Omega bloodline, and the prophesied one who would either destroy or redeem the Alpha King." The revelation hit the assembled council like a physical blow. Ancient prophecies were the stuff of legend and children's tales, not the political reality of warfare and conquest. Yet the evidence stood before them in the form of a woman whose very presence seemed to warp the air around her with supernatural energy. "The prophecy speaks of the Alpha King," Baylor continued, his voice taking on the cadence of ritual recitation. "A ruler who would unite the 7 kingdoms under his iron will, bringing order through fear and strength through conquest. But it also speaks of the Omega, the one whose touch could see into his very soul and judge whether he deserved redemption or destruction." Thorne's mind raced as pieces of a puzzle he had never known existed suddenly began falling into place. "You sent her to kill me," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving Elira's face. "We sent her to evaluate you," Baylor corrected. "The method of your end, should you prove to be the monster your reputation suggested, was left to her discretion. The true Omega bloodline carries gifts that make conventional assassination unnecessary." "What gifts?" Sir Gareth demanded, his sword now fully drawn, despite the flag of truce. Elira spoke for the first time since entering the hall, her voice carrying resonances that seemed to echo from depths far greater than her physical form could contain. "The gift of true sight, which allows me to see the essence of any soul I touch. The gift of influence, which can turn love to hate or courage to cowardice with the proper application of will. And the gift of ending, which can stop a heart or cloud a mind with nothing more than focused intent." The silence that followed her words was absolute, broken only by the crackling of torches and the distant sound of wind against the castle walls. Every person in the hall was calculating the implications of what they had just learned, that the blind peasant woman who had been sharing the king's table possessed the power to kill with a touch. Yet you did not use these gifts, Thorne said, his voice carefully controlled, despite the turmoil raging within him. You had opportunity enough, both through our dinners and our work in the garden. Why spare a man you were sent to judge? Elira's expression was one of profound anguish, her love for him warring visibly with the duty that had brought her to Drakmor. Because what I found when I touched your soul was not the monster they expected. Yes, you had done terrible things, made harsh decisions that caused suffering and death. But at your core, I found a man who had loved deeply and lost everything, who had built walls around his heart, not from cruelty, but from the desperate need to survive grief that would have destroyed a lesser person. How touching, Baelor said with obvious disdain. Unfortunately, your personal feelings are irrelevant to the larger situation. The prophecy is clear. The Alpha King must be brought to account for his crimes, either through redemption or destruction. Since you have failed to accomplish either in the months of your residence here, the matter will be resolved through more conventional means. Months. Thorne's voice was sharp with sudden understanding. She has been here mere weeks, has she? Baelor smiled with the satisfaction of a man revealing his final card. Tell me, Your Majesty, do you recall the merchant caravan that sought shelter in your castle during the spring storms? The group of traveling players who entertained your court during the summer festival? The delegation of pilgrims who requested passage through your lands in early autumn? Each reference sent chills down Thorne's spine as he realized the scope of the deception that had been practiced upon him. She was here before, multiple times, learning your routines, studying your defenses, mapping every corridor and passage of this castle, Baelor confirmed. The simple peasant woman you thought you knew was actually one of the most accomplished infiltrators ever trained by our people. Thorne turned to face Elira directly, his grey eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and heartbreak that made her flinch as if from a physical blow. Was any of it real? He demanded. The conversations, the garden, the love you claimed to feel, was it all merely part of an elaborate performance? The mission was real, Elira said quietly, tears streaming down her face despite her obvious attempts to maintain composure. The deception was real. But Thorne... She took a step toward him, only to stop when he raised a hand to warn her away. The love was real. Everything that grew between us, every moment of connection and understanding, that was never part of any plan. Yet here you stand in their company, Thorne observed with bitter coldness. Wearing their symbols, serving their purposes. I stand here because they hold my village hostage, Elira said desperately. Because refusal to complete my mission would mean the death of everyone I grew up with. Because sometimes love requires sacrifice, even when that sacrifice destroys the very thing you love most. Baelor stepped forward, clearly growing impatient with the emotional drama playing out before him. The time for sentiment has passed. Lady Elira, you will demonstrate your gifts upon our host, or your people will pay the price for your continued disobedience. No, Elira said firmly, her voice carrying new strength despite her tears. I will not. Whatever the cost, I will not use my gifts to harm him. Then you force our hand, Baelor said with regret that was obviously manufactured. From beneath his cloak, he produced a small crystal vial filled with clear liquid that seemed to glow with its own inner light. This contains a poison distilled from the essence of nightshade and wolf's bane, enhanced with certain alchemical properties that make it particularly effective against those of royal blood. Thorne's eyes fixed on the vial with the recognition of a man who had studied every conceivable threat to his life. The same poison your assassins carried, he said quietly. Indeed, originally intended for Lady Elira's use should she choose the path of destruction rather than redemption. But since she has proven unreliable in that regard, a more direct approach seems warranted. The threat was clear and immediate, but before anyone could react, Elira's pendant blazed with sudden light that filled the hall like captured lightning. The supernatural energy radiating from her small form was enough to make every person present take an involuntary step backward. And when she spoke, Her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in the very stones of the castle. "You will not harm him," she declared, her clouded eyes now blazing with power that made them appear to burn with inner fire. "Whatever the cost to myself or to others, I will not permit it." "Then you choose love over duty," Baylor said with satisfaction. "And in doing so, you confirm that the Alpha King has indeed corrupted the last daughter of the true Omega bloodline. The prophecy is fulfilled, though not in the manner we had hoped." "What does that mean?" Sir Gareth demanded, his sword still drawn but clearly, uncertain whether steel would have any effect. "Against the supernatural forces now manifesting in his king's throne room, it means that the Alpha King has proven himself irredeemable," Baylor explained with the patience of a teacher instructing a slow student. "By turning the prophesied Omega from her sacred duty to his own purposes, he has demonstrated that his corruption runs too deep for redemption. Therefore, destruction becomes not merely an option, but a necessity." The crystal pendant around Elira's neck pulsed brighter, and the temperature in the hall seemed to drop by several degrees. "I said you will not harm him," she repeated, her voice now carrying undertones that made the very air vibrate with power. "And I say that the matter is no longer yours to decide," Baylor replied. He raised the poison vial high above his head, and Thorne could see that the cork had already been loosened, ready to be removed at a moment's notice. "Surrender your crown, renounce your throne, and accept exile. Or I will shatter this vial, and we will all discover just how effective alchemical enhancement can be against royal blood." The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword poised to fall, and in that moment Thorne understood that everything he had built, everything he had fought to preserve, hung in the balance of decisions made by others. His kingdom, his life, his newfound love, all of it balanced on the edge of a crystal vial and the supernatural abilities of a woman whose true nature he was only now beginning to comprehend. The choice, when it came, would define not only his fate, but the destiny of everyone in the Seven Kingdoms. And in the blazing eyes of the woman he loved, he could see reflected the same terrible understanding that filled his own heart, that sometimes love was not enough to overcome the inexorable weight of prophecy and politics, and that the greatest tragedies were born not from hatred, but from impossible choices between competing loyalties. The war horn's mournful call echoed across the mountains as the first light of dawn revealed the full scope of the forces arrayed against Drakmore Castle. From the highest tower, Thorne could see them spread across the valley like a dark stain upon the landscape. 10,000 men organized into 3 distinct armies, each flying banners that represented provinces he had conquered and lords he had thought thoroughly subdued. The night had passed in a whirlwind of preparation and desperate strategizing. After Baylor's ultimatum in the throne room, the pretense of parley had collapsed entirely. The enemy lord had withdrawn to his forces with the satisfied air of a man who had achieved his primary objective, not negotiation, but confirmation that the prophesied Omega had indeed been corrupted by her feelings for the Alpha King. Elira remained in the castle, but as a prisoner now rather than a guest. Thorne had ordered her confined to the highest tower, not out of cruelty, but from the desperate need to protect her from both his own conflicted feelings and the supernatural forces she seemed unable to fully control. The crystal pendant around her neck continued to pulse with irregular light, and Lady Morgana reported that the air around the tower chamber crackled with energies that made her healing instruments vibrate sympathetically. "Your Majesty," Sir Gareth said quietly, approaching the battlements where Thorne stood studying the enemy positions. "The final preparations are complete. Food and water for 3 months, every archer positioned according to your orders, and the gates reinforced with iron bars salvaged from the old dungeons. And our friend Lord Aldrich? Confined to his chambers under guard as you commanded. Though I confess I'm not certain how much difference that will make if the siege is prolonged." Thorne nodded grimly. The discovery of Aldrich's likely complicity in the assassination attempt, combined with his all-too-convenient suggestions of surrender, had made the decision to neutralize him an obvious one. In times of war, even the suspicion of treachery could not be tolerated. The enemy's disposition, Thorne asked, though he had been studying their positions for hours. Baelor commands the main force directly in front of our gates, perhaps 6,000 men with siege engines being assembled behind their lines. Lord Voss of the eastern reaches approaches from the north with 2,000 cavalry, while Lord Caney brings up the rear with another 2,000 from the southern passes, a coordinated assault from multiple directions, Thorne mused. Someone has been planning this for months, possibly years. The question is whether they intend to storm the walls immediately or settle in for a prolonged siege, Sir Gareth observed. Our spies report extensive supply trains following each army, suggesting they're prepared for a long campaign. They'll try negotiation first, Thorne predicted with the certainty of long experience. Baelor thinks he holds all the cards now. Superior numbers, prophetic justification, and a supernatural weapon in the form of the woman He paused, unable to finish the sentence aloud. The woman you love, Sir Gareth said gently. There's no shame in admitting it, Your Majesty. Even kings are allowed to have hearts. Hearts make us vulnerable, Thorne replied, but there was less conviction in his voice than there had been in years past. They give our enemies weapons to use against us. They also give us reasons to fight beyond mere survival, the captain countered. A man defending what he loves fights harder than one protecting only his own skin. Before Thorne could respond, a commotion in the courtyard below drew their attention. A single rider was approaching the castle under a white flag, his horse picking its way carefully across the field that had been seeded with caltrops and other obstacles during the night's preparations. Another parley, Sir Gareth observed. Shall I have him escorted to the throne room? No, Thorne decided after a moment's consideration. I'll meet him at the gates. In times like these, it's important that our people see their king willing to face danger directly. The messenger proved to be a young knight in Baelor's livery, barely old enough to grow a proper beard, but carrying himself with the nervous dignity of someone entrusted with an important mission. His message was brief and to the point. Lord Baelor requested one final opportunity for negotiation, this time with terms that might prove more acceptable to all parties. What manner of terms? Thorne asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The safe passage of the Lady Elira to our lines. Your Majesty, in exchange for the withdrawal of our forces and your continued rule over the 6 kingdoms that remain loyal to your crown. The proposal was cleverly constructed, offering Thorne the appearance of victory while achieving Baelor's primary objective, removing the prophesied Omega from the Alpha King's influence and completing the mission she had been sent to accomplish. And if I refuse, then Lord Baelor regrets that more direct measures will be necessary to restore the proper order of things. Thorne studied the young knight's face, reading the mixture of fear and determination that marked a man caught between duty and self-preservation. Return to your lord with this message, he said finally. Tell him that Drakmor recognizes no authority higher than its own crown, acknowledges no prophecy save that written by our own actions, and yields nothing to threats or supernatural coercion. If he wishes to test the strength of these walls and the resolve of the men behind them, he is welcome to make the attempt. The knight bowed stiffly and departed, but not before Thorne caught a glimpse of something like relief in his young eyes. Honor satisfied, duty discharged, and now the matter would be settled by steel and stone rather than words and threats. So it begins, Sir Gareth murmured as they watched the messenger ride back toward enemy lines. No, Thorne corrected quietly. It began 15 years ago when I chose to rule through fear rather than love. This is merely where that choice leads, to walls and weapons, and the terrible certainty that someone must die before the sun sets again. The afternoon brought the first assault, a probing attack designed to test the castle's defenses rather than achieve any decisive result. Baelor's siege engines lobbed stones at the outer walls while archers provided covering fire for a small group of soldiers attempting to scale the fortifications with ladders, and grappling hooks. The attack was repelled without significant difficulty, but it served its purpose of revealing the defender's capabilities and response times. More importantly, it demonstrated that Baelor was in no hurry to resolve the conflict quickly. He was prepared to grind down the castle's defenses through attrition, confident that time and superior numbers would eventually achieve what direct assault might not. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed ominously appropriate to the day's events, Thorne found himself standing once again at the window of his highest tower. Below him, enemy campfires dotted the landscape like fallen stars, each one representing men who would willingly die to see him removed from his throne. The sound of footsteps on the stairs behind him announced Lady Morgana's arrival, her healing supplies clearly indicating the nature of her visit. She had been tending the wounded from the afternoon's skirmish, her skilled hands working to preserve life even as the larger conflict promised to claim many more. "How is she?" Thorne asked without turning from the window. "Physically unharmed but greatly distressed," Morgana replied. "The supernatural energies around her continue to intensify, and I fear that her emotional state is affecting her ability to control them. She could escape if she chose to," Thorne observed. "Her gifts would make it simple enough to overcome whatever guards we could assign, yet she remains. What does that tell you about her true loyalties?" Thorne was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications of Elira's voluntary captivity. That she values my safety above her own freedom. Or perhaps that she understands the consequences if she were to fall into Baelor's hands again. Or perhaps, Morgana suggested gently, that love truly can overcome duty when the heart is given freely rather than commanded by prophecy or politics. "Love is a luxury I can no longer afford," Thorne said. But the words rang hollow even to his own ears. "Tomorrow they will come in earnest, and I must be prepared to make choices that a man in love could never stomach, such as using her gifts against them if necessary, such as sacrificing whatever happiness we might have found together for the greater good of the kingdom, such as accepting that some prophecies fulfill themselves not through the actions they predict, but through the very attempts to avoid them." Morgana was quiet for a time, her experienced eyes studying the man who had ruled with such iron determination for 15 years, now revealed as someone struggling with the most human of dilemmas. "Would you like me to take her a message?" she asked finally. "Tell her," Thorne began, then stopped, uncertain how to express the tangle of love, regret and resignation that filled his heart. "Tell her that whatever happens tomorrow, whatever choices must be made, I want her to know that these past weeks have been the happiest of my life since Lyanna's death, that she succeeded in her mission of redemption, even if the ending is not what either of us would have chosen. And if she asks whether you forgive her for the deception, tell her that there is nothing to forgive. She was caught between impossible loyalties and chose the path of her heart rather than her duty. How can a man condemn such a choice when he would have done the same in her position?" Morgana nodded and prepared to leave, but paused at the top of the stairs. "Your Majesty, there is something else you should know. The energies surrounding Lady Elira, they're not just increasing in intensity, they're changing in nature, becoming something I've never encountered before. Dangerous? I don't know. But I suspect that whatever happens tomorrow, her role in it will be far more significant than any of us anticipated." As the healer's footsteps faded down the stairs, Thorne returned his attention to the enemy fires burning below. Somewhere among those countless points of light, Baelor was planning the assault that would come with dawn. And somewhere in the tower behind him, the woman he loved was wrestling with powers and prophecies that neither of them fully understood. The siege of Drakmor had begun in earnest. But Thorne suspected that the true battle, the one that would determine not just the fate of his kingdom, but the nature of prophecy itself, was only just beginning. In the morning, they would discover whether love could indeed overcome destiny, or whether some futures were too powerful to be changed by the simple choice of a wounded king and a blindly gifted woman to care for each other. The war horn sounded again across the valley, its mournful note carrying promises of blood and steel, and the terrible certainty that before another sun set, the Alpha King would face his final test. Dawn broke over Drakmor Castle like the opening of a wound, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that seemed to promise bloodshed before the day was done. The enemy forces had spent the night in final preparations, and now their siege engines stood ready, massive catapults and trebuchets that could hurl stones the size of wine barrels against the ancient walls, battering rams reinforced with iron bands, and tall siege towers that would allow attackers to reach the battlements, despite the castle's imposing height. Thorne stood on the highest rampart, fully armored for the first time in months, the weight of steel and mail feeling both familiar and strange, after so long spent in simple clothing, working alongside Elira in the garden. His sword hung at his side, not the ceremonial blade he wore to court functions, but the battle-tested weapon that had carved his path to the throne 15 years ago. Around him, his defenders made their final preparations, checking bowstrings and sharpening blades with the methodical efficiency of men who knew their lives might depend on such details. "They're moving," Sir Gareth reported, his own armor reflecting the morning light as he joined his king on the battlements. "All three armies advancing in coordination. Baelor's forces will reach our gates within the hour." Thorne studied the approaching formations with the eye of a veteran commander. The attack was being conducted with professional competence. No wild charges or heroic gestures, just the grinding advance of superior numbers applying pressure at multiple points simultaneously. Baelor had learned from the failed rebellions of the past, understanding that defeating Thorne required patience and overwhelming force rather than individual heroics. "Archers to the walls," Thorne commanded, his voice carrying across the courtyard with the authority that had kept him alive through countless battles. "Oil to the gates. Signal fires ready for lighting." Every man to his assigned position, the castle transformed into a hive of purposeful activity as 800 defenders prepared to face 10 times their number. Veterans of previous sieges moved with calm efficiency, while younger soldiers betrayed their nervousness through quick movements and constantly checked equipment. Above it all, the ancient stones of Drakmor seemed to vibrate with anticipation, as if the very walls remembered the blood that had been spilled in their defense over the centuries. In her tower prison, Elira knelt beside the narrow window, her supernatural senses tracking the approaching armies with far greater precision than any mortal observer could achieve. The crystal pendant around her neck blazed with such intensity that it cast patterns of light across the stone walls, and the air around her hummed with energies that made the iron bars of her prison resonate like tuning forks. She could feel Thorne's presence far below, his emotions a complex mixture of resignation, determination, and an aching sadness that spoke of a man preparing to die for something larger than himself. The love between them had become a physical thing in her supernatural perception, a golden thread that connected their hearts despite the walls and prophecies that separated them. Lady Morgana entered the chamber quietly, carrying a tray of food that Elira had no appetite to consume. The healer's eyes widened as she took in the supernatural display surrounding her patient, light dancing across surfaces that should have been in shadow, and an electric charge in the air that made her skin tingle with each breath. "The battle begins soon," Morgana said quietly, setting the tray aside and moving to stand beside Elira at the window. "It has already begun," Elira replied, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in frequencies beyond normal hearing. "I can feel their hatred, their fear, their absolute certainty that they fight for righteousness. And I can feel his pain, knowing that whatever the outcome, nothing will ever be the same." "He sent you a message," Morgana said gently. "He wanted you to know that these past weeks have been the happiest of his life since Queen Lyanna's death, and that you succeeded in your mission of redemption, even if the ending is not what either of you would have chosen." Tears ran down Elira's face, glowing with the same inner light that surrounded her form. "Tell me honestly, Lady Morgana, Do you believe he can win? Can 800 men truly hold these walls against such overwhelming odds? The healer was quiet for a long moment, her experienced eyes studying the formations below. In terms of pure military logic, no, they have too many men, too many siege engines, too much time to wear down our defenses. But your king is not a man who surrenders easily, and desperate men have been known to achieve impossible things. And if he loses, then Balor will take the throne. You will be returned to your people to complete your original mission in whatever manner they see fit. And the seven kingdoms will learn whether prophecy truly governs the fate of nations. Elira closed her eyes, reaching out with senses that transcended physical limitations to touch the minds and hearts of the men preparing for battle below. What she found there confirmed her worst fears: too few defenders, too many attackers, and a siege that would inevitably end in the destruction of everything she had come to love. There must be another way, she whispered, more to herself than to Morgana. What manner of way? I don't know yet. But I refuse to believe that love and redemption must end in bloodshed and defeat. There has to be a path that doesn't require choosing between duty and heart, between prophecy and free will. The first stones began falling as the enemy siege engines found their range, massive blocks of granite that struck the outer walls with sounds like thunder. Dust and chips of stone rained down on the defenders, but the ancient fortifications held firm, having been built to withstand exactly such assaults. Thorne moved along the battlements with practiced efficiency, encouraging his men while personally directing the defensive fire. His presence had a galvanizing effect on the defenders, seeing their king share their danger rather than commanding from safety, reminded them why they had chosen to serve him despite his harsh reputation. Remember, he called out as enemy archers began their covering volleys. They may have numbers, but we have walls, supplies, and the certainty that we defend our home. Make every arrow count, make every stone thrown back at them carry the weight of our defiance. The first scaling ladders reached the walls just after midday, carried forward by soldiers who had endured hours of defensive fire to reach the base of the fortifications. Hand-to-hand combat erupted along the ramparts as defenders used swords, spears, and anything else available to push back the climbing attackers. Thorne found himself in the thick of the fighting, his blade moving with the deadly precision that had made him legendary in his younger years. The familiar rhythm of combat, parry, strike, advance, retreat, awakened instincts that had been dormant during his months of peaceful gardening with Elira. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive, every sense heightened by the proximity of death and the desperate need to protect what mattered most. But even as he fought with skill and determination that inspired his men, part of his mind was calculating the mathematics of the siege. Too many enemies, too few defenders, walls that could not hold forever against such concentrated assault. Unless something changed dramatically, Drakmor would fall within days, and with it would die not only his kingdom, but any hope of the future he had begun to envision with the woman he loved. As if summoned by his thoughts, a new sound cut through the chaos of battle, a note of such pure, haunting beauty that it seemed to come from the very heavens themselves. Every man on both sides of the conflict paused in his fighting, weapons frozen in mid-swing as the melody washed over them like a benediction. From the highest tower of the castle, light began to pour like liquid starfire, and in its center stood a figure that blazed with power beyond mortal comprehension. Elira had somehow transcended the limitations of her physical form, becoming something that existed at the intersection of prophecy and possibility, divine will and human choice. Her voice, when it came, carried across the battlefield with clarity that reached every ear despite the vast distances involved. "Enough," she declared, and the word itself seemed to reshape reality around it. "This ends now." The supernatural radiance pouring from the tower bathed the entire battlefield in light that seemed to exist beyond the normal spectrum of human vision. Warriors on both sides found their weapons suddenly too heavy to lift, Their anger transformed into something approaching awe as they witnessed power that belonged more to legend than to the world of politics and war. Elira descended from the tower not by stairs or rope, but through the air itself, her form wreathed in energies that made the very atmosphere shimmer around her. The crystal pendant at her throat had become a miniature sun, pulsing with rhythms that matched the beating of every heart within miles of the castle. When her feet touched the battlefield, flowers began to bloom in her footsteps, despite the churned earth and spilled blood. Lord Baelor, who had been directing the assault from a position of relative safety behind his siege engines, found himself compelled to approach the transformed woman despite every instinct of self-preservation, screaming warnings in his mind. His face was pale with recognition and fear, for he was beginning to understand that the prophecy he had sought to fulfill was reshaping itself according to rules no mortal had anticipated. "Lady Elira," he said, his voice carrying none of its earlier confidence, "you have transcended your earthly limitations, just as the ancient texts foretold. The time has come to complete your sacred mission." "My mission," Elira replied, her voice now carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in the bones of every listener. "It was to judge whether the Alpha King deserved redemption or destruction. That judgment has been made." Thorne approached from the castle walls, his armor discarded and forgotten in his desperate need to reach her side. The supernatural energies surrounding Elira seemed to recognize him, parting like curtains to allow his passage while remaining impenetrable to others. When he stood before her, the light around them intensified until it became difficult for observers to make out their individual forms. "What judgment?" Baelor demanded, his hands clenched into fists as he realized that control of the situation was slipping beyond his ability to influence. "The Alpha King is dead," Elira announced, her words carrying across the battlefield with the finality of fate itself. "He died in a garden where love taught him to nurture rather than destroy, where gentle hands showed him that strength could exist without cruelty, where a blind woman helped him see the man he had forgotten he could be." Gasps and murmurs rippled through both armies as the implications of her words became clear. If the Alpha King was dead, metaphorically, spiritually, fundamentally transformed, then what did that mean for the prophecy that had driven them to this confrontation? "In his place," Elira continued, reaching out to take Thorne's hands in hers, "stands a man who has learned that true power comes not from fear, but from the courage to be vulnerable. Not from conquest, but from the willingness to create. The prophecy is fulfilled, but not in the way any of us expected." The light surrounding them began to pulse in rhythm with their joined hands, and suddenly every person on the battlefield could see what Elira's supernatural sight had revealed weeks ago, the essential nature of the man who had ruled them through 15 years of iron discipline. They saw his grief, his loneliness, his desperate love for a queen who had died too young. They saw the gradual hardening of his heart as protection against further loss, and then its recent awakening under the gentle influence of a woman who had been sent to destroy him. Most importantly, they saw the choice he was making now, to lay down the crown of the Alpha King and take up the more difficult burden of ruling through love rather than fear. "The old prophecy spoke of ending," Elira said, her voice growing stronger as the supernatural energies around them reached their crescendo. "But ending can mean transformation rather than destruction. Death can mean rebirth rather than annihilation. The Alpha King is dead. Long live the king who chooses to serve rather than to dominate." Lord Baelor staggered backward as if struck by a physical blow, his carefully constructed plans crumbling, as the spiritual foundations on which they were built revealed themselves to be shifting sand. "This is not how it was meant to be," he protested. The prophecy was clear. The Omega would either destroy or redeem through divine judgment, not through love. "Love is divine judgment," Elira replied simply. "What greater test of a soul's worthiness could there be than its capacity to inspire and receive genuine affection?" What more profound transformation could exist than the choice to open a hardened heart to vulnerability and trust? The transformation was not limited to the supernatural display surrounding the two figures at the center of the battlefield. As Elira's power reached its peak, something fundamental shifted in the very nature of the conflict itself. The bitter hatred that had driven men to take up arms against their former king began to dissipate, replaced by confusion, then understanding, then something approaching forgiveness. Soldiers who had been prepared to die in the assault on Drakmor found themselves remembering not the harsh taxes and brutal punishments of Thorne's reign, but the peace and prosperity that had marked the years when his rule had been tempered by Queen Lyanna's influence. They began to see that the tyrant they had come to overthrow was himself a victim of grief and loss. A man who had built walls around his heart not from cruelty, but from the desperate need to survive unbearable pain. Sir Gareth approached the supernatural, tableau with wonder written across his weathered features. Throughout 15 years of loyal service, he had hoped for exactly this moment, the return of the prince he had sworn to serve, the resurrection of the man who had been buried beneath the weight of crown and sorrow. "My king," he said quietly, dropping to one knee before Thorne and Elira. "Command me, one by one." The defenders of Drakmor followed their captain's example, laying down their weapons and kneeling before the transformed couple. The gesture was not one of defeat or submission, but of recognition, acknowledgement that something fundamental had changed, that the harsh rule they had endured was ending not through conquest, but through the infinitely more powerful force of genuine transformation. The moment stretched into eternity, charged with possibilities that seemed to remake reality around them. Then Lord Baelor, faced with the complete collapse of everything he had planned and hoped for, made a choice born of desperation and wounded pride. From beneath his cloak, he drew the crystal vial of alchemically enhanced poison, its contents glowing with malevolent light that formed a dark counterpoint to the radiance surrounding Elira and Thorne. His intention was clear. If he could not have victory through prophecy or battle, he would achieve it through simple murder. "If the Alpha King is truly dead," he snarled, raising the vial high above his head, "well, then let us bury him properly." But the moment his fingers began to work the cork loose, Elira's power manifested in ways that transcended anything she had displayed before. The vial flew from Baelor's grasp without being touched, sailing in a perfect arc to shatter harmlessly against the castle walls. More than that, the poison within was transformed by her will into something beautiful, crystalline butterflies that danced through the air before dissolving into sparkles of harmless light. "No more," she said firmly, her voice carrying absolute authority. "The time for poison and hatred is past. From this moment forward, we choose a different path." Lord Baelor stumbled backward, his face grey with the recognition of complete defeat. The supernatural forces he had sought to harness and control had turned against him, revealing the fundamental flaw in his understanding of prophecy itself, that it was not a fixed destiny to be fulfilled, but a potential to be realized through the choices made by those it touched. Around them, the armies that had come to wage war began the slow process of laying down their weapons, not in surrender, but in recognition that the conflict they had come to fight no longer existed. The Alpha King was indeed dead, and in his place stood something far more dangerous to the old order, a ruler who chose to govern through love rather than fear, supported by a woman whose supernatural gifts were focused on healing rather than harm. The battle for Drakmor was over, but the real victory belonged not to any army or political faction. It belonged to the simple, revolutionary idea that even the hardest heart could be softened by genuine affection, that even the most broken soul could be healed by the patient application of understanding and forgiveness. As the supernatural light began to fade and Elira collapsed into Thorne's arms, exhausted by the effort of channeling such immense power, the king who had once ruled through fear looked out over a battlefield, transformed by love and made a promise that would reshape the 7 kingdoms forever. From this day forward, he declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the field, we begin again, not as conqueror and conquered, not as king and subjects, but as people choosing to build something better than what came before. The cheers that rose from 10,000 throats carried more hope than any victory. Cry in the history of the realm, 6 months after the day that would come to be known as the miracle of Drakmor. The castle that had once been a fortress of fear had transformed into something entirely different. The harsh black banners that had flown from its towers for 15 years had been replaced with new colors, deep blue and silver, representing the union of earthly wisdom and celestial grace that now guided the kingdom's governance. The wedding ceremony took place in Queen Lyanna's restored garden on the first day of spring, when the roses that Thorne and Elira had nursed back to life burst into bloom with an abundance that seemed almost supernatural. Representatives from all 7 kingdoms attended, no longer as conquered subjects but as honored guests, celebrating the union of 2 people whose love had literally transformed the nature of rulership. Itself, Elira wore a gown of white, silk that seemed to capture and reflect light in patterns too, beautiful for mortal artisans to have designed, though Lady Morgana insisted that no magic had been involved in its creation, only skill and the deep satisfaction that came from creating something worthy of such an occasion. The crystal pendant that had blazed with such terrifying power during the battle now rested quietly against her throat, its light soft and warm rather than overwhelming. Thorne had chosen to forego the elaborate crown of the Alpha King, replacing it with a simple circlet of silver that caught the morning light without dominating the features of the man who wore it. His clothing, too, was simpler than royal tradition demanded, fine materials worked with excellent craftsmanship, but without the intimidating grandeur that had once been his signature. Sir Gareth performed the ceremony himself, his weathered voice carrying easily across the garden as he spoke words that had been written specifically for this union. We gather today not to witness the joining of king and subject, he began, but to celebrate the marriage of 2 souls who have found in each other the completion they had sought throughout their separate journeys. The vows they exchanged were personal rather than formal, spoken from the heart rather than from tradition. When Thorne promised to honor and cherish the woman who had seen past his fearsome reputation to the man beneath, his voice carried the weight of absolute sincerity. When Elira pledged to stand beside him in building a kingdom founded on justice tempered with mercy, her words rang with the authority of prophecy fulfilled. The rings they exchanged were simple bands of gold, inscribed not with royal seals or family crests, but with words from the poetry book that had belonged to Queen Lyanna. Love is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. The inscription served as both promise and reminder that true love endures not despite adversity, but because of the strength it gains from weathering storms. Together, among the guests, Lord Baelor sat in a place of honor that would have been impossible to imagine 6 months earlier. The defeat of his rebellion had led not to execution or exile, but to forgiveness and an invitation to participate in the new order being built from the ashes of the old. His hair had gone completely white in the months since the failed siege, and his eyes carried the humility of a man who had learned that his understanding of prophecy and power had been fundamentally flawed. I sought to use the prophecy as a weapon, he had confessed, during one of the long conversations that had marked his gradual rehabilitation. I saw it as a tool for achieving political ends, rather than a spiritual truth about the transformative power of genuine love. The failure was not in the prophecy itself, but in my limited understanding of what redemption truly means. The transformation of Drakmor's governance extended far beyond symbolic changes in decoration and ceremony. The harsh laws that had defined Thorne's reign as the Alpha King had been systematically reviewed and reformed, with input sought from representatives of every province and social class. Taxation had been reduced to levels that allowed prosperity to flourish while still maintaining the kingdom's infrastructure. Most importantly, the network of spies and informants that had once been used to maintain control through fear had been redirected toward identifying and addressing the legitimate grievances of the people. Lady Morgana had taken on new responsibilities as the kingdom's chief advisor on matters of healing and welfare. Her knowledge of herbs and medicine expanded to encompass the spiritual as well as physical health of the realm. Under her guidance, houses of healing had been established in every major town, staffed by those trained in both conventional medicine and the gentler aspects of supernatural arts. The garden where the wedding ceremony took place had become more than just a memorial to Queen Leanna. It had evolved into a symbol of the kingdom's rebirth. Under Elira's careful tending, plants from every province now grew side by side in harmonious profusion, representing the unity that was gradually replacing the fear-based divisions of the past. Visitors came from across the realm to see the place where love had literally transformed the nature of power itself. As the ceremony concluded and the guests moved toward the castle for the celebration feast, Thorne and Elira lingered in the garden, reluctant to leave the peaceful sanctuary where so much of their relationship had developed. The afternoon sun cast golden light through the flowering vines that covered the arbor, where they had first acknowledged their feelings for each other. "Do you ever regret it?" Thorne asked quietly, his hand intertwined with hers as they walked among the roses. "Choosing love over duty, abandoning your original mission for an uncertain future with a man who was supposed to be your enemy." "Never," Elira replied without hesitation. "The mission I was given was based on a false understanding of what the prophecy truly meant. I was sent to judge whether you deserved redemption or destruction. But what I discovered was that redemption is not something earned through worthiness. It is something offered freely to those willing to accept the vulnerability that comes with genuine transformation. And if the prophecy had required your destruction rather than mine, if saving me had meant sacrificing yourself," Elira smiled, the expression transforming her entire face with its radiance, "then I would have made that choice gladly, knowing that love freely given is never truly lost. But that was never what was asked of us. The prophecy spoke of ending, but endings can be beginnings if we have the courage to embrace the unknown." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Sir Gareth, his formal bearing softened by genuine affection for the couple whose union he had just consecrated. "Your Majesties," he said with a bow that managed to be respectful without being servile, "your guests await your presence in the Great Hall." "Of course," Thorne replied, but he made no immediate move to leave the garden. "Sir Gareth, I have been meaning to ask, do you truly believe we can make this work? Can a kingdom founded on the principles of love and forgiveness survive in a world that still largely operates through fear and force?" The captain was quiet for a moment, his experienced eyes surveying the garden that had become a symbol of transformation. "I have served 3 kings in my lifetime," he said finally. "One who ruled through inherited tradition, one who governed through calculated politics, and now one who chooses to lead through the strength of his character and the depth of his compassion. Of the 3, I can say with certainty that the last has achieved the most lasting influence. But will it endure?" Elira pressed gently. "When we are gone, when the memory of this day fades into legend, will the principles we are trying to establish survive the inevitable challenges that will test them?" "That depends," Sir Gareth replied with the wisdom of long experience, "on whether you can teach others to find the same strength in love that you have discovered in each other. Change that touches only the surface rarely lasts beyond a single generation. But transformation that reaches into the heart of what it means to govern and be governed, that has the potential to reshape the world." As they finally made their way toward the castle for the wedding feast, the sun began to set behind the mountains that surrounded Drakmor, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that seemed to promise endless possibilities. In the Great Hall, representatives from every corner of the 7 kingdoms waited to celebrate. Not just a marriage, but the birth of a new vision of what leadership could accomplish when guided by principles higher than mere power. The feast that followed was marked not by the formal protocols that had defined court functions during the Alpha King's reign, but by genuine warmth and celebration that crossed traditional boundaries of rank and status. Lords and ladies shared tables with merchants and craftsmen, while children from the castle staff played games in the corners under the benevolent supervision of adults who remembered what it felt like to experience joy without fear. Toasts were raised not just to the health and happiness of the newly married couple, but to the transformation they represented, the possibility that even the hardest hearts could be softened, the most bitter divisions healed, the deepest wounds transformed into sources of strength and wisdom. As the evening drew toward its close and the guests began to make their way to their chambers, Thorne and Elira found themselves once again standing at the window of his tower study, looking out over a kingdom that was theirs to shape and guide. The view that had once shown him only the weight of responsibility and the burden of ruling through fear now revealed possibilities that seemed as limitless as the star-filled sky above. "Tomorrow, we begin the real work," Thorne said quietly, his arm around his wife's shoulders as they contemplated the future that stretched before them. "Yes," Elira agreed, leaning into his embrace with the contentment of someone who had found her true home. "But tonight, we celebrate the miracle of two people choosing to see the best in each other, despite every reason to do otherwise." In the distance, a nightingale began its evening song, its melody drifting across the garden where roses bloomed in defiance of the approaching winter. The sound carried with it the promise of spring's return, of cycles of renewal that would continue long after the current generation had passed into memory. The Alpha King was indeed dead, as Elira had proclaimed on the battlefield 6 months ago. In his place stood a man who had learned that true strength came not from the ability to inspire fear, but from the courage to remain vulnerable in the face of uncertainty. Together with the woman who had been sent to judge him and had chosen instead to love him, he would spend the rest of his days proving that even the most entrenched systems of power could be transformed by the simple, revolutionary act of choosing compassion over cruelty. The prophecy was fulfilled, but not in the way anyone had expected. And in the garden below their window, the roses that had been planted in memory of one queen continued to bloom in celebration of another, their fragrance carrying the promise that love, once rooted in understanding soil, would flourish for generations yet to come.